through the frozen morning light. Tell me what's to come. Say my time is near.
I mean, it doesn't matter. Anything will be. Huh? That's awesome. Oh yeah. That's awesome.
Let me see what I can.
I mean, it's better than the styro. Yeah, no, this another one needs to be perfectly fine. Are we? Oh, I do have a question. Are we using this mic, or are we using a lav mic?
You tell me what you want. I'll get it.
Let's do a lav mic because I usually move from out the podium.
Okay.
Okay.
wish it would rain. I guess when everybody gets quiet, that's my cue to start. So, good evening. We can do a little better than that. Good evening. All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight to listen to the 12th annual Walter R. Murray Lecture. I am Dr. Roosevelt Noble. I serve as the Assistant Dean of Residential Colleges. I also serve as the Director of the Bishop Joseph Johnson Black Cultural Center, Faculty Head in Stanball, and I teach in the Sociology Department. Now that we're 2 minutes into the program, tonight's visit, Dr. Jack is actually visiting Vanderbilt as a Patterson Fellow. He's had activities yesterday with students. He's had activities today with students, as well as faculty and staff. We had a wonderful lunchtime discussion with him. He's had dinner this evening, and he has events planned for tomorrow as well. So we're very excited to have him on campus for a 3-day visit as a Patterson Fellow. Tonight he will deliver the 12th Annual Walter Murray Lecture. I do want to acknowledge some people who have helped make this day possible before we dive into introducing not only him, but also giving a little background about exactly who was Walter Murray to understand why we're here and who this lecture is itself named after. First and foremost, I want to thank and recognize Vice Chancellor Andre Churchwell in the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I want to recognize and thank Interim Vice Provost William Robinson, the Office for Inclusive Excellence, Vice Provost Vanessa Beasley, residential colleges, and many hats as well, so I would again introduce all hers as well. And Vince Durnham, who's also here in the back. And Vince is the USN head of school who really got this ball rolling when he approached me at one of the welcome events and was like, hey, here's this book. I think we should bring this guy to campus, bring him to Nashville. And so lo and behold, I went back and forth with your agent. Your agent is very aggressive. You should definitely pay him whatever he's worth. We went back and forth negotiating contract after contract, and I learned way more than I ever wanted to, but we eventually got it done. But about Walter Murray, who this lecture is itself named after. Walter Murray came to Vanderbilt in 1966. He was a graduate of Pearl High School, which is the same high school that one of our more infamous alums as well, Perry Wallace, attended. Walter came to Vanderbilt on a band scholarship. He was also very significant and very active within the African-American student population on campus, but not just within the African-American student population, but within all of our students, which is why typically when I speak about Walter, I reference him as a bridge builder. He was a person to kind of help to establish and make connections across many different aisles, and I think that's one of the things that he, in fact, shares in common with our speaker tonight. I want to introduce you briefly to and give some of his accolades. I won't be able to go through everything that makes Dr. Jack special, but to share some, Anthony Abram Jack received his PhD from Harvard University in 2016. He's a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and assistant professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He holds a Schultzer Assistant Professorship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. His research documents the overlooked diversity among lower-income undergraduates, which he calls the doubly disadvantaged. These are people who enter college from local, typically distressed public high schools, and the privileged poor, those who come from boarding day schools or preparatory high schools. His scholarship appears in the Du Bois Review, Sociological Forum, and Sociology of Education. He's earned awards from the American Sociological Association, Eastern Sociological Society, and the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Additionally, Dr. Jack has held fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, as well as the 2015 National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship. The National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan named him the 2016 Emerging Diversity Scholar. The New York Times, Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the Huffington Post, the National Review, everybody under the sun has referenced his research and his writings as well as his biographical profile of his experience as a first-generation college student. His book, The Privileged Poor, How Elite Colleges Are Failing Poor Students, was released in February 2019 by the Harvard University Press. And this is the research for which he will speak to us this evening. So please join me in giving a wonderful welcome to Vanderbilt to Dr. Anthony Jack.
Can y'all hear me okay? Awesome. We switched up to the lavalier mic. My head has been on a swivel for the last 48 hours. As I told some students when I first got here, I didn't get to do a college tour. I did not know that people could dedicate 3 weeks of time and money to just travel around the country to visit schools. And so now that I'm able to do this, I am especially thankful. I feel like that high school senior back in 2003, but instead of actually seeing all my peers coming back from visits, I'm the one who's doing all the going and coming. So I want to say thank y'all for this invitation to campus. Thank you to everyone who helped bring this together to be part of the legacy of this particular talk in the name of Reverend Walter Murray is an honor. To be a first is not always easy. In fact, it is often hard and many challenges, but to know that you stand in part of that legacy is incredibly amazing. Thank you all for my first trip to Vanderbilt. It is an honor to be here because it's part of, I hope, a continued dialogue about access and inclusion, especially in the midst of these uncertain times. But before I continue, I want to say a special thank you to the college's unsung heroes, the janitors, the security guards, the groundskeepers, the cooks, and secretaries, whose work may be invisible to some, but it does not make it any less important. I hope this talk today is one of many conversations about the new responsibilities that diversity demands of all of us, students and professors, practitioners, and administrators alike. In this talk today, I begin with my own experiences of being a lower income first generation college student as they serve as background to my research, but also provide insight into its origins. I then couple this personal narrative with lessons learned from my research on how poverty and inequality shape students' trajectories to and through higher education that have consumed me for the last decade. One of my favorite quotes in literature reads, "It is not due to dwell on dreams and forget to live." I know some of you remember it because you remember Albus Dumbledore. His words stayed with me the first time I read them, but I didn't quite understand why. Why something in fantasy was making me feel in such an emotional way. But after thinking about it, after a long work-study shift at one of my jobs, his advice, I realized, was a much-needed reminder to a first-generation college student who worked 4 jobs to support his family back home to slow down. His words dared me to enjoy the here and now of being a student at Amherst College. You see, because beyond my inability to order out or go to Antonio's for pizza, I thought I couldn't even go to concerts, even if tickets were free, if a work shift became available. You see, rest was a luxury I thought I could not afford. At the same time, however, I couldn't escape the reality that my entering Pratt dormitory in 2003, and even mine standing here as a Harvard professor, is a testament to the fact that even undreamt dreams come true. I'm talking about those generational dreams that my grandparents held onto in their hearts, but they couldn't quite put into words. You see, when the world was coming down around them and they were excluded from attending the closest school because they were white only, they, like W.E.B. Du Bois, grasped, quote, to a hope, not hopeless, but unhopeful. You see, they supported a nerdy, chubby kid who read books and watched cartoons in all of his academic endeavors. Their love paved the way even when specific help on the road to college was absent. And many of us and many of our students arrived at the college gates along similar uncharted paths. And this is a common reality. You see, higher education is highly unequal and depressingly stratified. Although roughly 1 out of every 2 students in the country are the first to attend college in their families and come from lower income backgrounds, just 14% of undergraduates at the most competitive colleges come from the bottom half of the income distribution. Again, just 14% of undergraduates come from the bottom half of the income distribution. Instead, those from lower income families are disproportionately relegated to community, for-profit, and less selective colleges where resources are fewer, graduation rates are lower, and national investment is all but absent. You see, this contrast in destination is made even more striking when you consider that 38 colleges in America have more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60, a reality that you all know here very well. At Washington University in St. Louis, the ratio is almost 4-to-1. But this disparity is especially troubling when you consider that selective colleges like Amherst and Harvard, Vanderbilt, and Michigan served as mobility springboards for those from non-traditional backgrounds. But here's the problem. We were once kept out of these bastions of privilege by a devilish duo. We were excluded by lack of information on the one hand and tuition costs that rivaled or even eclipsed our family's annual incomes on the other. The price of the ticket was simply too high. Changing this reality, colleges finally realized that they were missing out on America's greatest untapped resource, those from humble means with Herculean drive. And some colleges took action. Beginning with Princeton in 1998, they introduced no-loan financial aid policies to combat the class inequalities that have a stranglehold on our delicate democracy and even more fragile system of higher education. Amherst announced a similar policy the following year. Through these initiatives, colleges reached out to say that money will no longer be a barrier to entry. It will no longer curtail your success. This made me happy, for I too benefited from this policy. But uncritically praising universities as democratic institutions for simply increasing access reflects a limited civic imagination. A generous financial aid and admission letter do not a diverse college make. Access ain't inclusion. You see, sometimes I worry if colleges have extended invitations to excited, eager, able youth before adequately preparing for their arrival. Some universities have forgotten an old truth, that citizenship is so much more than just being in a place. It is being of it and accessing all the rights and privileges pertaining thereto. You see, this is what I study, but it's also what I lived and lived. Where are the other poor black folks? That's the first question I remember asking myself walking out of Johnson Chapel outside of convocation. Because I had just been invited to take part in those innocent conversations that I'm sure many of you all remember, when people conveniently work in verbal versions of their resume or narrate their summer schedules for all to hear. My new peers, both black and white alike, swapped stories of multi-week trips abroad and parties hosted at second homes. They regaled us with personal accounts of courtside seats to professional basketball games and private premieres to movies that had not yet hit theaters. Hell, they even knew about Canada Goose before it was cool. Now, where I'm from, PJs don't mean private jets, but I learned something new that day at Amherst. These people had things that I associated only with rich people. Studying abroad, knowing what a hostel was, second homes, and all these hosts of different things. My first time on a plane was actually traveling from Miami to Amherst from my recruiting trip. Family vacations for us was simply driving up I-95 to a cousin's house in Georgia. What I thought I found that day was the legacy of Bowen and Bach's groundbreaking study, The Shape of the River. You see, in this work, Bowen and Bach showed that an overwhelming majority of black students, contrary to stereotypes, were actually the children from elite black families. They were the sons of lawyers, the daughters of commerce, the children of doctors. I resigned myself to be, yet again, the only poor black person in a rich white place. Imagine my surprise, however, when one of my classmates who studied abroad for her entire junior year of high school also came from a single-parent household that struggled to make ends meet. Feeling comfortable with each other, we shared stories of doing homework by candlelight. We did this not to be romantic, but rather because the power was out. We knew a common struggle all too well, that sometimes there was more month than money. The vacation home my peers actually ventured to, it turned out were not always their own. It was those of their wealthy high school peers. Alas, I was not alone. I was not the only one granted access to places and experiences beyond what my family could afford or even knew about. But here's the thing and how research and life kind of collide. Like my freshman imagination, social science research did not make space for these experiences as part of the larger first-generation college student story. When they wrote about us, when they wrote about lower-income students, they wrote of a single experience chronicling culture shock and isolation for, quote, an undifferentiated group of students at risk. Yet all the while, as my research was the first to uncover, colleges were hedging their bets. They were getting their new diversity from old sources. You see, my research focuses on life at pseudonymous renowned university, an elite university in Northeast that adopted no loan financial aid policies. I spoke with 103 Black, white, and Latinx undergraduates about campus life and did observations of campus life for 2 years. I wanted to pay attention to one particular thing. I wanted to know, what does it mean to be a poor student on a rich college campus? And I pay particular attention to how lower income students at Renown have shared beginnings but lived ever more divergent lives en route to college. I explore the experience of those who live in poor, often segregated communities, but enter college from elite boarding day and preparatory high school like Andover, Exeter, Choate, and St. Paul's, those who I call the privileged poor. And I compare their experience to their equally economically distressed peers who enter college from local, typically distressed public schools, those whom I call the doubly disadvantaged. Now, admittedly, these terms are loaded. To be honest, my choice in terms is purposeful. In addition to the oxymoronic quality of privileged poor that kind of sticks with you, even to engage with or even find fault with the term still forces you to engage with a question. How can someone be both privileged and poor? On what axis of inequality are we speaking? Even using the qualifier doubly inspires an intersectional way of thinking when there previously wasn't one. But as I said, this is as much professional as it is personal. And personally, I want to move the conversation away from individual differences to focus on how structural inequalities like segregation, poverty, and the hollowing out of America's breadbaskets and its center cities dictate how students navigate the experiential core of college life, those overlooked moments between convocation and commencement. And I have long grown tired of analyses simply that compare those from people whose family went to college and those from those who did not. You see, my investigation into this overlooked diversity pushes back against the dangerous downplaying of how prolonged exposure to savage inequalities in our neighborhoods and in our high schools manifest themselves on our campus, if the students get there at all. For we cannot escape the fact that while some neighborhoods keep us from hurt, harm, and dangers, others place us in the thick of it. Instead of justice rolling like that river and righteousness like that mighty stream, some communities, mostly those that are black and brown, still get led. And you see, conventional wisdom dictates you have to know where you've been to know where you're going. To understand the undergraduate experience, the same sentiment is true. We must examine where students come from and what they have been through to understand why they chart the paths they do once they arrive on campus. Which students immerse themselves into the college community? Who wants to leave after the first week? Who gets those really beautiful, long, detailed stories of excellence and ambition in their letters of recommendation? But who says, I couldn't breathe here? Who calls their college a toxic environment? Or who likens their college to deja vu? To overlook the rich diversity of experiences among first-generation college students is then to base policy on only a partial picture. As it stands, our understanding of how poverty, inequality, class, and culture shape college life remains incomplete, and the policies and practices that we implement simply miss the mark. You see, the privileged poor and the doubly disadvantaged, by virtue of their disparate high school experience, have different access to what sociologists call dominant cultural capital. And I know it's a term that many of us have used or heard in our classes, but for tonight, let's simply think of cultural capital as those taken for granted ways of being that are valued in a particular context. Taken for granted ways of being that are valued in a particular context. We act one way at home and get rewarded or sanctioned. We act one way in class and get rewarded or sanctioned. In college, it's the same thing. Colleges expect students to be comfortable and proactive in forging relationships with faculty from the moment they set foot on campus. These relationships are the road to letters of recommendation, internships, invitations to special dinners, and introduction to coveted events. This is the road to emotional support when times get rough. This is the road to the benefit of the doubt even when you know that you are in the wrong. Yet this expectation to be proactive, this expectation to reach out remains unsaid. There's no manuals of do's or don'ts, whens or hows. And unspoken, if undergraduates want something, they will let us know operates as the gold standard. The college corollary to the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Imagine the culture shock then that some first-generation college students experience navigating what sociologist Gene Anyon calls the hidden curriculum. Alice, a quick-witted Latina with a penchant for short answers, attended a segregated public high school. She revealed to me that her 4 years before college was filled with peers fighting, skipping school, and setting trash cans on fire. Her teachers exhausted themselves maintaining order. There was nothing left in the tank for making connections. Needless to say, her college transition was rough. She said, Tony, college contradicts everything about my life back home. The people, the buildings, the very culture of this place. Professors informally say, yeah, my door is always open, but she doesn't believe them. She said, I feel too intimidated, too afraid to talk to people, and rarely go to school-sponsored people for anything. You see, for Alice, hunkering down and doing things on her own is the right way to get ahead, and her behavior makes sense. It helped her through middle school where disorder was the norm. It helped her through high school where contact and help from teachers was not always present. Hunkering down and doing things on her alone helped her get to college. How should she feel in office hours, a term she has never heard before until she stepped foot on the college campus, when her teachers in high school oftentimes left before the bell even rang? But in contrast, Agun, a reflective and discerning Latina, hails from a troubled neighborhood but attended an affluent boarding school with a $212 million endowment. Her largest class was 12 students. Every single one of her classes, with the exception of one, was taught by a PhD. Contact with those teachers who have those PhDs was an ever-present reality both inside and outside the classroom. They served as dorm parents. They served as coaches. They served as mentors. Office hours were literally built into the culture and the structure of the place. It should come as no surprise when she felt, quote, empowered to go and talk to a professor and say, hey, I want to meet with you. She went on to say, she said, Tony, my school instilled in me that I'm allowed to do that. It's actually my right. When her instructor was away from campus, Agun had no qualms calling his cell phone for prearranged virtual office hours despite her friend's surprised looks. You see, what was new for Alice was old for Agun. What was a mismatch for one was a match for the other. And these differences result not from differences in drive or ambition, but rather societal defects. One was trained in a system that privileges and teaches and explains why reaching out is important. The other was brought up in a system where there were no opportunities to reach out at all. But here's the problem. Colleges reward students based upon the behavior that they see, not understanding the inequality that shapes it. One residential advisor shared with me that when it comes to nominating students for different awards and prizes, she says, Tony, the nomination process is relationship dependent, unfortunately. It enables students who develop relationships a leg up in the process. And with the look of someone admitting an uncomfortable truth, she said, oftentimes the best candidates are not even put forward. It's hard to tease out what is nepotism, cronyism, favoritism, or whatever you want to call it. The reality is that undergraduates from America's forgotten neighborhoods and ignored schools are truly disadvantaged if we continue to privilege privilege. Engaging college officials is smart, and it's rewarded, it's helpful. But these lessons do not fall evenly across the populace. As the old maxim goes, talent may be evenly distributed across the country, but opportunity is not. Colleges cannot assume that all students have been permitted time to practice these skills, let alone master them, before they arrive on campus. But there's something more important in that lesson. There are things that we as college officials must be proactive in. We must be better at giving help and be better at who's deserving of it. College and universities must not label those who do not immediately seek out support as being less deserving of it. More importantly, we need to return to basics. Let's define office hours in our classes and in our offices. Why do faculty always say when they are, but they never say what they are? There are lessons that colleges must learn or at least remember. Those from whom college environment is new should not be the only ones forced to grow, adapt, or change. But I am not so naive. knowing how to navigate social relationships with faculty is not the only hurdle that lower income and first generation college students face. There are certain obstacles that no amount of cultural capital helps you overcome. Walking around campus in March, I always hear stories of home to rest, Europe for backpacking, and Mexico for traveling. You always see students coming back extra tan wearing store-bought straw hats. But when you're broke, spring break means something totally different. As one student told me, a lower income Latina named Valerie from California, she said, Tony, while all the other peers are going out and having fun, there's always famine during spring break. You see, Alice and Agun both know hunger sting all too well, and not just when food stamps ran out at home. They encountered food insecurity, not knowing where their next meal was coming from every year in college when their college closed eateries during breaks. You see, their college assumes that all students depart campus for fun in the sun, a reality that many of you know, but this is a common college practice. Of all the colleges in America that have adopted no loan financial aid policies, so those that are arguably the most progressive in their thinking about access and inclusion, less than 1 in 5 keep their dining halls open without restriction during spring break. This is not a new problem despite new interest in it. This is a problem that generations of students have faced. And I remember this reality a decade and a half ago at Amherst when they opened the gates but forgot to keep the doors open to those of us who couldn't afford to leave. You see, nestled next to my extra long twin sheets that we purchased on sale from Marshall's was an unexpected stowaway. The reality that access to food would not always be a given. And I remember walking past Valentine Dining Hall and the lights in the hall would be out. Only the emergency exit lines blazed red in the darkness. The chairs were stacked on top of the table as if Tito had just finished vacuuming but also had just moved out of sight. But even in the dim lighting of those emergency exit lines, we could still see the plates and trays, but this time we were seeing them through the gates that barred us from entry to the place that we spent more time in than any other place on campus. My students at Renown knew that reality all too well, because at Renown, cafeteria closures result in 1 out of every 7 students facing food insecurity year after year. And I want you to think about that for a second. At one of the world's wealthiest universities, with a multi-billion-dollar endowment, 1 out of 7 students can chart hungry days on the calendar without fail. To make matters worse, and again, some of you know this reality all too well, some colleges charge students upwards of $35 a day to stay in their room or the room of someone on vacation. One school went as far as to change the lock on the outside of every single residential house to prevent entry. But again, let us not think this is isolated to a handful of colleges. National estimates say that 2 out of every 5 undergraduates in America are food insecure. But more so than the rates, let's think about the lived reality behind those numbers. Because one student asked me a question I still don't have an answer for. She said, how can we support ourselves if we can't even feed ourselves? But capturing this reality with comedic seriousness, Ariana says that spring break is the real Hunger Games. But just how close it comes to living in the districts is downright depressing. One young white woman with a pixie haircut wearing a blue Columbia University sweater stood brave in a room of about 200 fellow first-generation college students. She stood up and then she didn't speak. She looked at me as if for courage and then began to discuss how she spent her last spring break at one of the wealthiest universities in the country. She increased her online dating activity in the week before spring break to secure dates the following week. You see, banking on gender norms of older men paying for the first meal, she felt that her only option was to use OkCupid as if it was DoorDash. She treated Tinder as if it was Grubhub. In order to eat, she offered her time. This makes no sense. But far too many of our undergraduates face this year after year, and a shocking number face it day after day. But I want to be clear, this goes beyond just what lower income and first generation college students face. What about the students who don't have a home to go to? The disowned, the unwanted? What about those students who know the reality that home and harm are synonymous? You see, for universities, new students require taking on new responsibilities. We must move from simply worrying about access, who gets in, to inclusion, their experiences once they cross through the gates. We must ensure that social class, both symbolically and materially, does not keep lower income students in secondary positions at first-rate institutions. To embark upon the noble and needed task of making these institutions look more like the world and not just the top 1%, we must question what we take for granted, both about what students know and what students can afford. Students' experiences underscore how access and inclusion are two separate institutional mandates. We must work to ensure that students don't just graduate. That's almost too easy of a goal in some respects. What happens if our goal was a higher one of not just graduating, but graduating whole and healthy, ready for the next adventure, not limping across stage saying, I will never, ever set foot on a place that treated me so poorly for 4 years? As each class becomes ever more diverse, so do colleges' connections to once overlooked communities. The consequences of these new ties is that various inequalities are brought into sharper and sharper relief. Do we know how to support those who grew up on farms and in center cities? Are we prepared to help students through a bad harvest as well as the loss of a family member due to gang violence? These are new questions we must ask ourselves because we cannot run from these connections. We must learn from them. As Viola Davis said, diversity is not a hashtag to be celebrated today and put on the back burner tomorrow. We must demand better of our alma maters. We must demand better of ourselves. When James Baldwin reflected on America, his home, he noted, I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. To the students present, your college is your home, and you are its citizenry. Do not let the college receive donations in the name of diversity, but spend those monies fortifying places that you are not even allowed in without having your voice heard. Do not sit idly by while your stories are used to promote an image of the college and those beautiful lies that are college brochures where that shows more diversity than you will ever see on campus if that is not your reality on campus. No longer should you, to borrow from Paul Laurence Dunbar, wear the mask that grins and lies, the one that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, for we have paid that debt of human guile a long time ago. So I'll close with this. As you, as Vanderbilt, look forward to celebrating 150 years of educating tomorrow's leaders, as you pursue truth and excellence, dare to demand as much of Vanderbilt as Vanderbilt demands of you. And in that quest, go back to the lessons that Langston Hughes taught us oh so long ago when he implored us to hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. So be unapologetic, be bold, be you. Thank you. Is this? Which is my favorite part.
I know I'm a scholarly publisher, so. How do you center the public audience in your writing, and what advice can you give scholars who have similar goals?
I'm actually getting in trouble for how easy it is to read the book. Someone actually said that the weakness of the book is the flip side of its strength. it was written for a general audience and not just other academics. And I'm thinking about, is that a bad thing? And I'm being real. I was talking to a group of students I tell that because there was a beautiful article, I think in either New York Times or the Chronicle of Education that said, academics can change the world if we only start talking to ourselves. And I fundamentally believe that. And so for that to come out the day after this review was published, I kind of laughed because we are still in this mindset of you have to sound smart to be smart. And I think there's a fundamental difference between writing well and being able to communicate. Communicate is a higher order when you actually have your audience in mind. I have a simple rule that some academics scoff at, other people understand. My mom has a high school education, right? She likes to read, but she's not going to pick up an academic book. My standard for writing is if my mama can't read it, I don't want to write it. Because what's the point of only talking to other people who have the same degree? What's the point of only being able to engage the minds of those who you are already trained in the same way? If I'm trying to convince a provost to change a policy, a dean to address food insecurity on their campus, a high school teacher to understand the kind of inequalities that students are experiencing at home, let alone the group who I really wrote the book for, fellow first gens who are trying to understand their college experience, if I start using language that is ostracizing, then what the hell, why am I even doing this? Right, it's like, to be honest with you, I don't really give a damn what other academics think about how, do I use these overly worried things? Oh, you're supposed to say like the hegemonic this or the cultural capital this and, cite people every which way. Like that's what articles are for, to be honest. But when we write for a general audience, it's to educate, to communicate, to share our knowledge with the general audience. And I think we need to change the value system in publishing, but also promotion of other things because literally, what is the point of an article that's just going to stick behind a paywall that no one is going to read just to have a line on your CV? Like, I can actually say that more than 20 schools have changed their dining hall policies because of what was in the book, because people have said, oh, I understand what's going on my campus now. If I'm trying to tell you what's going on your campus, but I'm doing it in a way that makes you defensive or makes you feel dumb because you don't quite understand what I'm trying to say and it's your reality every day, it's not really worth it. I mean, for me, as someone who doesn't want to be a poverty pimp and just write about inequality, but actually do things to change it, the only way you can do it is to actually have people do it. So, okay. There was a question. Yes.
I can be really loud.
Let's use the mic just make sure everybody can hear.
Thank you, Dr. Jack, for being here today. It's really great to hear from you. I am a master's student in the higher education program here, and I have a background in working at a boarding school in the Office of Admissions. So one thing that I constantly notice is there's a divide between secondary education and K-12 and higher education. And when it comes to promoting student success, especially when thinking about the doubly disadvantaged students and the privileged poor, do you think there's any room for collaboration between K-12 and higher education?
I mean, I think if anything, what the book the book calls for that, right? In some respects, this book is as much about the college experience as it is about documenting the disparate, the true gulf between the K through 12 experiences, not between those who go to a good public and a bad public, but just how drastically unequal our private and public schools are. Right? Why is it that you have to go to a private school to get a shot at going to a selective school if you're low income? Like, that's a question I hope people ask themselves. Like, why do we need programs like Prep for Prep, TEAC, A Better Chance to give students a shot at having upper mobility in the country? Why do we have to put them in schools that can only have 400 students, not in a grade, but the entire school? I hope that certain people. So one of the best things about working at a professional school, especially a professional school of education, is we have greater contact with principals, counselors, headmasters, and those individuals. And so what people are starting to do is also take lessons And like, what are the things that we can use as bridge moments or bridge experiences between college and high school? And one of the things that some school systems have done after they've done professional development at Huxley is they've changed the name of PTA meetings to office hours, should be something very, very small. But imagine like when you start being intentional with use of language, and you not just change the name, but then you begin to explain what they are. The way in which you can bring families along this journey from a much earlier part than just like wait until they get to school, but like bringing families in, teaching them skills or how to navigate a particular institution that actually will be an 8-year journey and not just a 4-year journey when their child actually leaves. There are little small things that we can actually do to be very, very clear about certain things. And people have been, inventive in how they do it. But I think if this book does anything, it calls for a greater understanding of the inequality in K through 12 system. But let's stop talking about just the inequality between publics. We have to bring privates into the conversation because, as one of my students at Harvard is studying, why do we always use the bare minimum, like a bare minimum kind of, let's raise all the boats to a certain level? What happens when we actually use the kind of inequalities that we actually see as like our benchmark, right? The fact that why can't more students go to a school that has a 1 to 20 teacher ratio rather than 1 to 30 or 1 to 40? Like, let's bring it down from 40 to 30. But if you go to some of these suburbs, it's 1 every 20. Why not? Why are we using just a much lower benchmark to help students when it comes to like eradicating inequality? Right? Those are kind of questions. Why is there a $23 billion difference in America annually between predominantly white and predominantly non-white school districts? Like, what happens when we think about the consequences of that? Some of my research is in that conversation because we have to understand just how drastically unequal our students' experiences are before they get to college, so that we can be better prepared to understand why they chart the path they do once they get to campus.
Dr. Jack, thank you so much for your work. I love how you talked about the hidden curriculum and students needing to know these things that aren't readily apparent. What are some strategies that we can use to reach out to these students? Because we have all these wonderful programs.
Yeah.
But how do we get these students to show up so that we can give them these tips and this knowledge even during orientation or those first couple of weeks of school? How do we get them to come?
Well, let's actually start with orientation. Orientation right now is currently for legacies and donors. Right? The way in which many universities structure orientation is parents and families that have a whole bunch of time that can be able to stay and do fun things like going hiking and I don't know what else they do. Like, my mama had to leave like hours after she dropped me off. We literally drove up, we went to Walmart, and they left. That was it. That's all we could afford to do because they had to get back to work. The way in which we leave out families at orientation, when we have a perfect moment of being able to engage them and let them know there are certain new rules, because as one of my students will tell you, the reason why I think we should remember something, students don't come to college alone, families come to college. And the fact that we don't pay attention to our lower income and first generation and working class families is part of why some of our students don't come to offices, because how many people in this room have heard this? As one of my students' father, he said, Mija, you don't want to get ahead based on kissing ass. You want it based on hard work. It'll take longer, but you'll feel more proud. Or what about what other parents say, when you get to that school, don't bother those people. Like, keep your head down, do good work. Because that's how they kept their jobs for 20 or 30 years. If you work, my brother's a janitor, my mom is a security guard. The reason why they have kept their jobs for 30 and 20 years is because they don't make a fuss. Their name is known only for the person who they can get called for a double if needed. It's not those who are always pushing the boundaries, all that kind of stuff. So they're giving us life lessons that kept them employed and us fed. But the way in which we actually have to tell families that the rules of the game have changed. Right now, making your needs known, making your wants known is how you get ahead, how you access the institutional resources at this place. That's the most important thing. We have to bring parents along. And we can do a whole bunch of things. One, when you send stuff home, make sure you're sending stuff home in the language that is spoken at home. And also realize that not everyone's family can both read and write in certain languages. So what happens if you can also send videos home where you actually speaking in the native tongue to actually say that office hours are a time that professors are set aside to answer questions. You should go because here's what office hours can do for you. Like, we have to be intentional because that cognitive dissonance of lying to our families, of saying I'm not going to go because and listening to them, but then also realizing, who do I trust? Do I trust my family who bust their ass to get me here, or do I trust the people who I just met but who I know can help me get to the brighter future? That moment, those experiences are pure hell. We must be very intentional with language. And I want to keep bringing it back because I'll put myself on Front Street. When I got to Amherst for the first time, I thought it was a much more religious institution because everybody kept talking about fellowship. And I'm thinking like, oh, they're talking about going to church, they're talking about getting eat, like let's break fellowship, break bread. They were talking about Rhodes, Marshall, Baineke, and all these things. And I was like, oh, that word I had not heard about in the same way. Or thinking about the first time I ever heard the word bursar was actually when I was listening to Hamilton. Right? There are certain words on the college campus that you only hear within the vicinity of a college campus. And if you are brand spanking new to this place, you don't have that experience. Some things can be as simple as syllabus, but also certain things, like trying to explain what a Fulbright is to a parent who didn't go to college, a Marshall, a Rhodes, what a letter recommendation is, when that's a form of currency that they have never heard about. We have to be better, we have to be more intentional about understanding what are the true motivations for avoiding adults. And that's why I focus on explaining why certain students have different orientations and realizing that it's not an individual thing, it's a reflection of what helped them get there, so we can be more attuned to how we insert ourselves into their lives. But we have to start early and make sure that we are talking to them, and oftentimes them and their families. Yeah, another question over here,
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful talk, Dr. Jack. My name is Brian Best. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the Department of Teaching and Learning here at Vanderbilt University. And my question is about finding your voice in the academy, particularly as a black male academic. I love the way that you tell your story, and at the same time, I feel like this space is very political, and like there can be certain consequences for positioning yourself in a particular way. And so I'm curious to know how you came to find your academic voice and just be comfortable with it.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, to all the doctoral students, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I want to say that now, because the first couple of years and that last lap are sometimes the hardest. When it came to finding my voice, I had to realize something. I had to make sure that I understood what they told me I had to learn better than they did. And when I was able to do it, then I was able to, in my mind, be the translator. How would I explain this to someone else? What you begin to realize is good writing gets noticed in the end. Right? I don't mean like waiting for a long time. Like when you are able to be precise, write well, write with the audience in mind, you get to be part of certain conversations. So the first thing was like making sure that I was able to speak their language, but then also translate it. And that translated is when I truly found who I was. Because I'm thinking to myself, like, how do I not speak just to them? And when I realized that my audience, my goal, was to make sure that anyone who picks up my writing can understand it, that's when I got better. I got better because I started reading, I started reading more fiction. That was incredibly important to me. To be a good writer, you must read good writing. Like hands down, no matter whether you're a scientist, an engineer, a humanist, a social scientist, read good writers and learn and find out things that really always make you smile, like that turn of phrase, the way in which they always introduce characters. That was incredibly important to me. And then always keeping in mind who I wanted to be able to pick this up. Now, book writing is different from articles. I can bring in James Baldwin. I can bring in Toni Morrison. I can bring in excerpts from Gloria Naylor and other people who I've read, and being strategic with it. Like, so when I write for the New York Times, it's a different way of writing than when I write for the article. Like, I always keep the audience in mind and be authentically who I am, but making sure that I am also within the bounds of being able to be published without being censored. And so there's always that negotiation. But reading good writers, being a translator with a understanding of who your audience in mind is. And then the last thing I would say is you gotta have fun. Like, this is a long process. I was in graduate school for 8 years. Part of it was I was collecting data, and data was getting good to me. I didn't want to stop it. But you have to have fun with it. Writing is incredibly difficult. No matter how good you are, it's incredibly difficult. And I found that I was happiest in the editing process. Don't believe that you have to have that perfect sentence on that first try. Like, I'm gonna say something, and I'm not trying to make anybody mad, but even if it's shit on paper that you can edit and hone and scale, and it becomes beautiful over time. That is literally how writing happens. Anyone who says, oh, I did this in one take, it probably was garbage. But you know how to maybe sound like extra, because like when you start to read people's paper and they like start using bigger and bigger words to mean more things, that means they don't actually know what the hell they're writing about. But when you are able to write simply, and you go through that editing process and you learn your own tics, you learn the way in which your mind works, and you realize that you start putting in colloquialisms from home, and then you do that sparingly so you can actually still make it your own, that's when you find joy in the process. And that last part, having fun with it, that is incredibly important. So right now, it may be only the time you have fun is in the titles of the articles or the titles of your papers. Have fun with that so that it can so it can still feel like you, even if you have to sit there and do a lit review and say, well, in 1984, Pierre Bourdieu introduced the topic of this in his book, Distinction, and it feels stale and dry. But the way in which you are able to then combine those sentences and combine that fun, the fun has to be part of it. So read the good writers, learn the material better than the people who actually expect you to, and then have fun with it.
I want to throw one in real quick, and then I'll
Okay,
go
cool.
to Cooper. What do you say to our students who sometimes find themselves in a position to where their greatest source of stress is that they're a first-generation college student at a highly ranked, prestigious institution? And to an extent, it's one thing to be a first-generation college student at your home state school, but it's another thing to be that at Vanderbilt. And sometimes that pressure of being at Vanderbilt and getting that Vanderbilt or that Harvard or that Yale degree can cause you to basically stay in situations when sometimes either one, you should get out, or two, because you're not finding the resources that you need, or two, there's this unspoken expectation that you got to come here and you got to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer.
Yeah.
You can't come to here and be philosophy major, English major. You can't waste this opportunity at this good school.
Yeah. I will say this, a lot of our families have worked tremendously hard to get us to a specific point along the journey, and we forget the last part of that sentence, a longer journey. The moment of acceptance into college is that moment of jubilee, right? It's just that, like, all the videos when everybody is crying and everybody is super happy and excited, and then the next morning you wake up and you realize that no one knows what's next, right? No one knows the process of what's next when you are first gen and or low income. And that's the part that gets really difficult, because sometimes you are pushed down a particular path, but no one knows about how to, like, from step one to the step off stage, no one knows what to do. Because everybody thinks, like, for example, to go to law school, you must be pre-law. or to do something, it has to be like this very, very narrow set of steps. When actually law schools want people who can write and argue, right? And why philosophy and engineering and English are popular law school majors, right? Our families don't know that. Like, we don't understand, there isn't an understanding of just how wide of a path into certain industries there actually are. Now, if you want to be a PhD in chemistry, you probably should be a chemistry major. That's different. But the way in which it's the school, like Vanderbilt, like Amherst, that can open so many doors to professions that you want if you have the right skill set, that's something that is never talked about in those living room conversations with families that don't know the power of a degree or the power of the process. They don't know that you can use your summer internships to give you a much better chance at going to law school or going into business or going into engineering than a one specific major, right? They don't understand that particular process and how you have that navigation. It's hard for me to be too prescriptive to tell students what to do when they're struggling, except for one thing, and I'll get to that in a second. There are also things that you have to do to compromise. If your parent is paying for something, and this goes to all students, or if you can't come home while you're in college if you don't do something, the fact of the matter is many of us have to do it to be able to maintain some semblance of relationship with our family. However, that doesn't mean you can't minor or do other things where you use the rest of your time to actually enjoy the hell out of being an undergraduate as compared to what your parents are forcing you to do. Because we all know that some families, if you don't do a particular thing, they will remove all resource. They will basically disown you in every single way and force you to drop out. I don't want to wish that upon anybody. But if that is your situation and you know that is your situation, there are things that you can do to supplement your experience to make it more fulfilling than just that. And then when you graduate and you actually get a job and you can be more independent, then you can actually begin to negotiate those ties and manage those expectations in a way that gives more power and authority to you. But what I will say is this. If you are struggling or if you are dealing with something or with something positive or good and everything in between, the most powerful thing you can do is ask for help. Help seeking is the most important skill you can develop in college. To have 4 years to practice and hone that skill of asking for help. Because the reason why I believe that help seeking is a sign of strength rather than a weakness as we are taught or that we are inundated with, help seeking to me is knowing that you are at the boundary of your own understanding about something. Or you are about to embark upon a journey that is better traversed with others than alone, and you are smart enough, you are wise enough to enlist others to help you support on that journey. Because it will make damn near any experience more manageable, whether it's dealing with peers, professors, parents, the good things, because honestly, sometimes I'm in a position right now where a lot of good things is happening, but when you grew up poor in a neighborhood that you always think like, okay, when is this going to end? Like, it's harder to believe the good than the bad at times. The bad you get used to the bad. You come to expect it. To get good news is almost like shocking and you distrust it. That's how messed up the world is, especially when you have such few resources. But seeking help is the most important thing you can do to begin how do you navigate this tough relationship with family? How do you manage their expectations but then still become your own person? Those are questions in which that you can begin to have. I am out in this so we can get to the student question. Therapy is one of the most beautiful things that you can have. And while you are on somebody else's insurance, somebody else's dime, go. Because therapy is expensive as hell. No matter how good the insurance is, black folks always say, look, I got that good insurance. Back home. And I mean that seriously. Because there are very few times that I actually kind of respect celebrities for talking about things in a very, very personal way. But when it comes to seeking mental health support, I am indebted to people like The Rock, Taraji P. Henson and others, because they actually talked about the range of reasons why going to therapy helped them, both when their life was going so well that they felt they had to say yes to everything, because if they said no, then people would judge them or people would stop calling them. And then other things like when you lose a parent or when you lose a sibling and all those kind of conversations, that help seeking is a beautiful, beautiful skill. And then once you get used to it, again, I'll end with this, recommendation letters in college become promotion at work. Right, the way in which you have to get to know people and they get to know you, they nominate you for certain things, they speak up for you when you are not in the room, it doesn't end in college. When you get your first job, to get promoted, you have to find a mentor. You have to find someone who's going to help you navigate this new terrain. Because if you think that all of a sudden you get all the knowledge in school, I'm a first-gen faculty and I feel lost half the time trying to navigate an institution that I've been at for 12 years. Because every day, every semester is a new configuration of responsibilities, and you have to learn how to do it. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Jack. Thank you so much for your time at this lecture and at the Dean's Dinner beforehand. A question that I had is, where do you find that voice of strength to speak about the situations you're going through or the problems that a university may face and not feel too indebted to or too scared of the institution itself to speak up? And on a larger note, how to do that after life at Vanderbilt, when you may feel not as well fed, not as strong as other people, how to still have that strength as a first-gen student?
For me right now, this is part of the larger project, right? I feel empowered because it's my job, right? It's part of my job. It's that usable knowledge pillar at Hugsy in which we are evaluated, right? Can people actually use your research to change their high school, change their classroom, change their college? And that has always been important to me, because I was inspired by a simple fact. And I asked myself this question as I was beginning the project: why in the world am I hearing about in interviews problems and situations that I experienced 15 years before? Why are students experiencing today at a richer university the same problems that I experienced as a freshman at Amherst College? And so I wanted to be able to be part of that change, because I knew what it meant to live off of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches 3 meals a day while also working 40 hours a week at the gym to support me buying that food and having to stay on campus, let alone sending money back home, right? I knew that complex reality. So I wanted to push back against that. The thing is, what we have to realize, your admission and your financial aid does not set up any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not deferential. Maybe there's deferential relationship with the college. It's not, you don't owe them anything for admitting you, right? In many ways, it's their responsibility to live up to what that admission letter actually entails, right? It is about not just your financial aid that you get an email from the comptroller or the bursar. It is about that living experience, right? Vanderbilt and other schools pride themselves on being residential colleges, and they funnel tremendous resources into being a residential college. It's also their responsibility to realize that only 1/3 of their students are more likely to go to residential events than the other half, because of just how ostracizing some of the events are. Right? Someone is doing an interesting thing right now online. It's like, why do we always have cheese and wine at events? That is a very class set of hors d'oeuvres. I remember the first time I actually had to write hors d'oeuvres out. I did not know it was spelled like that. And just like the way in which a lot of the things that we take for granted about being in this place, from dress code to the type of food we serve to the type of outings that we have, not saying that they should be completely done with, but we must make sure that the very things that we are using to welcome students aren't those that keep them on the boundaries. And a lot of times that we actually do. I mean, because how many people remember their admitted student event? For a person of color, I remember many students told me that when they walked into the room of an alum's home, the only other person of color that they saw was wearing a tuxedo and serving the food. And it ended up being a jacket and tie event, and no one told them because everyone just assumed that they knew to wear a certain tie. And one student was actually wearing a big Converse shirt, and he said he'll never forget this. As soon as he walked into the house, he snatched his fitted cap off his head, and he never ever put the cap back on. Because he remembered that moment. He was like, okay, I'm going to this school. I got in, and then he got there and he realized that that no one else came from anywhere like he was coming from. The way in which we have these events and how it's set up, and again, what we take for granted about how students can navigate them becomes incredibly difficult from the moment. And imagine that. That's even before you get on campus. Right? So we have to make sure that once we get that admission letter, we don't set it up as saying, okay, like here's this. Now be very quiet. Don't make a noise because you owe us for doing this. It's the other way around. The school owes you not just that letter, but everything that letter entails. And you have to begin to, in your own way, I don't want to dictate how you take ownership of it, but in your own way, come to believe it, come to see it, and then come to act on it.
And I think that's a powerful point for us to go ahead and conclude on. So students always understand that the university needs you a whole lot more than they will ever let you believe. We will now have some time for Dr. Jack to sign copies of his book out in the lobby. We also have refreshments, so please feel free to take those and partake as well. So let's give Dr. Jack another round of applause.
Thank you.